My name is Katie. We're going to talk about discovery, what it is, why it's important, and how it can help your organization. We have Rosie here. Without further ado, Rosie, tell us about discovery.
Great. Thanks, Katie. Thanks, everyone, for taking the time to join today. We are going to talk about discovery, what here at Sphere we call intelligent discovery. And why we call it intelligent discovery will become more apparent as we go through the webinar this afternoon. So I want to start with a quote. I like using quotes because I could use someone else's intelligence to make myself look smart. But I thought this was super relevant to our discussion today. And it's a quote that says, things don't turn up in the world until somebody turns them up. And I think this is important because discovery is not a passive activity. You can't expect to just sit there and things will pop up and say, hey, look at me, I have an issue, fix me. When it comes to finding issues in your environment, discovering, and primarily what we're going to talk about today is accounts and entitlements, it is something active. You have to go out and find them. What exactly is discovery? So discovery really is a complete inventory of your environment. And in the context of what we're talking about today, it's really about identities. And the way that we define identities is the humans, the people that work in your organization. But it's finding the accounts, the groups, group membership, the servers, all of the assets in your organizations, databases, application, entitlements, all the relationship between all of these different assets in your organization. And when we're talking about locking down accounts or onboarding accounts into a vaulting platform, it's discovering whether or not the accounts that you believe should be in this vaulting solution are in fact in this vaulting solution. Now, there's a concept that we talk about called hidden accounts. They're not so much hidden, but they are, going back to that quote, accounts that you have to look for. People think about Active Directory, or they think about LDAP, or they might think about something like Okta, for example, as this is my primary directory. This is where all of my accounts live. Unfortunately, accounts can live in hidden places or other places. When you set up a Windows device, you're going to have a bunch of local accounts that potentially can live on that Windows device. Same thing for Unix. You could have a bunch of local database accounts. These aren't so much hidden, but sometimes they're ignored. And they are accounts that can represent just as much risk to you as those accounts in Active Directory that might have privileged access to a Windows server, for example, or privileged access to a database. So understanding all of your inventory of all these accounts, understanding what these accounts can do, but more importantly, what they should or shouldn't do is critical. And throughout this webinar, I'm going to have different statistics, things that we've picked up from primarily Gartner. So one interesting one is that according to Gartner, 62% of security teams operate with limited visibility across their environment. Now think about that, right? They don't know everything that they have. They have no idea about all of the entry points into their environments, all of these accounts, all of these entitlements. They have little or no visibility. But discovery, or at least finding all of these accounts, just simply is not enough. It's easy enough to write some script that could pull all of your Active Directory accounts, or go out to all of your Windows devices and bring back all the local accounts, or ask your DBAs, I need a full inventory of all your local Oracle accounts, all the local Sybase accounts. But that's just raw data, and it's just simply not enough. So what is enough? Well, what you have to do is you have to understand ownership. It's one thing to know that an account called B Smith exists, or an account called SVC application Y exists, but who actually owns that account? Who is able to take responsibility for whether or not that account should actually exist, never mind what entitlements that account has and whether or not it actually should have those entitlements. Ownership is key to everything you're going to do. Without ownership, you cannot take action. And we'll talk about that in later on in the webinar. The next thing you're going to want to know is account type. What is a service account? What is an admin account? What is a regular user account? Bucketing these accounts into these different categories is critical to take the step of actually remediation, because the way that you treat a service account is different than the way you treat an admin account. But more important than categorizing these accounts is having an understanding of what are the controls that I want to apply to one or the other. For example, you might have an account that is a regular user account, but in the way that it's being used in your organization, it's really a service account, right? So labeling that account as a regular user account, but then applying that last step of controls tells you, you know what? I've just discovered that I have an account that should not be a service account, but it actually is operating in my environment as a service account. I now have a violation. I have something that I need to correct. Now, when we're talking about controls, it isn't just about looking at scale, right? We talk about here at Sphere, we talk about quality versus quantity when it comes to your controls and your violations. And really, it's the idea that just because an account has a lot of access doesn't necessarily mean that is a security issue or that's a problem. And that's that concept of quality versus quantity. For example, if we have an account that has access to all your Windows devices, seems pretty bad, right? Seems like something that's concerning. Now you can have a single account that has access to only one device. And I would ask, which one do you think is worse, right? Is it worse to have one account that has access to all your Windows devices or one account that has access to a single Windows server? What if I tell you that the account that has access to all of them is your SCCM service account, which obviously has to have access to all your Windows servers? That's okay. But what if that one account that has access to that one Windows server is actually owned by someone in the marketing team who should have no business having privileged access to a Windows server? Sorry, Katie, I'm picking on marketing. But the quality of understanding that relationship between that one account that happens to be owned by marketing, not needing that access should not exist, versus a known service account that must have access to all your Windows servers, and it does have access to all your Windows servers, that is okay. So controls is taking all that raw data that we collect from just collecting all of the accounts, all of the entitlements, and then making sense of it. And that's why it's more than just an inventory. It's an inventory and an understanding. So let's talk about those relationships, right? Because again, everything that you're going to collect is about relationship, but there are two types of relationships. There is a collected relationship and a derived relationship. And let's talk about that. So a derived relationship is something that you determine. It's going from pure discovery to intelligent discovery. It's going from just collecting the data to understanding the data. And we can look at that as some of the key things that we talked about that you're going to be collecting, right? Identities, the humans that work in the organization, the accounts, the groups, the applications, the servers. These are all things that you're going to collect in doing that discovery of what do I actually have in my environment. And to some extent, the relationship between these things you're going to collect as well, right? You're going to collect the fact that this account has access to this server, and this account is a member of this group, and this group has access to this application. Now, notice that there's no lines between that middle portion, that identity, and any of the other assets, right? Because that is a derived relationship. You can collect everything about entitlements and everything about all the metadata about the accounts and the groups and the servers and everything else. But the pieces of information that you have to derive are the things that you can't simply have technology respond to you. You might have a book of record that has ownership information, but how much can you rely on that, really? Because it is something that has to be manually updated. So the derived relationships, the things that you have to have some knowledge and do some work and coding around is things like ownership. What identity should own this account or this group or the server or this application? Account types, again, as we talked in the previous slide, is something else that you have to derive, right? What is the type of account? Is this a service account? Is this an admin account? Is this group used for this purpose versus that purpose? Is this a production server or a development server? Is this a SOC application or is this an application used for development? And finally, overlaying all of this and using all of this data to then determine what is an actual issue, what is my quality versus the quantity, is controls and violations. And you really, with controls, you have to use all of this data, right? Because you could have a violation that incorporates ownership or account type or any one of those blue lines between an account and a group and a server and an application. All of these could exist and could be perfectly fine, or a single line represents the single biggest risk to your organization. So overlaying those controls and violations really tells you this is what I need to fix, right? Because just looking at the raw data, it's just a jumble of data that you really don't know, is this okay? Is this not okay? So why is it important? I mean, if you're on this webinar, if you're listening to this, especially if you're listening to this live, again, thank you everyone for coming. You know why this is important, right? But the bottom line, that first bullet point is probably the most relevant one. You can't protect what you don't know. To me, it's you have this big room in your house that's a mess. It's got boxes everywhere, it's clothes lying everywhere, and dust everywhere, and you have to clean it. You have to organize it, you have to clean it, you have to mop the floors, you have to vacuum. Now imagine you're going into that room with the intent of cleaning it with your eyes closed. Sure, you'll trip over that jacket and say, oh, I got to pick this up. And you'll run into that box and start organizing what's in the box. But the reality is, before you could even start, you really should open your eyes, look around, assess what you have, figure out what belongs in that room, what doesn't belong in that room, and then clean up, right? You have to think about your accounts as keys to a safe. And imagine you had a safe with the most important thing that you own, and there are potentially thousands of keys floating out there, and you don't know who owns those keys, who has those keys, how many keys are out there. It's something that you have to do. And again, there's some stats along the bottom. I won't go through each of these, but modern breaches, the way that attackers are attacking people or attacking organizations, is through the lack of knowledge, right? Through the lack of control around that service account that isn't onboarded into a platform such as CyberArk. It's those local accounts that no one has been looking at, and the attacker recognizes exists and takes advantage of. So this is the reason why this is important. It's how we protect our environments. The question inevitably is, why is it so hard to do? Why do we see time and again organizations essentially failing to have a good picture of everything in their environment, a complete idea? If you ask someone who is not in technology, who is not in security, and you say, do you think most organizations know all the accounts that live in that organization? They're probably going to say, yeah, of course. Why wouldn't they? It's ridiculous that they wouldn't know that. Again, keys to a safe. How would you not know? But the reality is, because accounts are so pervasive, as we've talked, because accounts can live anywhere, because the modern way that we work allows all of these things to exist, it is difficult to have a good understanding of these things. But the bottom line is that the bad guys, the people that want to do harm to you, they have a lot of time. They could take as much time as they want. Eventually, they'll get a hit. Eventually, they will find that Oracle account that you didn't even know existed, or that local Windows server account that then gives them access to a domain controller, gives them access to a critical application server. They could take all the time in the world. You can't. Because they have a lot of time, you don't. You have to escalate things. You have to discover these things immediately, because someone that would do you harm could be 6 months into finding that one vulnerability. Next, and this is probably the biggest challenge, you really have to be an expert across all those target platforms. Collecting data from Active Directory or collecting all local accounts from a Windows device is simple enough. But there's all sorts of edge cases when it comes to collecting data from Sybase, or collecting data from an Oracle server, or collecting data from a Unix device and collecting pseudo permissions. There's all these little edge cases where you're going to need a database expert. You're going to need a server expert, a Windows expert, a Unix expert. So having all of these people all focused in on just solving this particular problem is not that easy. All of those people, you might have all those people, all those experts in your organizations, but they actually have full-time jobs. The other thing is, as what we see in much larger and even medium-sized organizations, is that obviously you can't have a single person or even a small group of people that are responsible for creating and managing all the platforms in the environments. You're going to have a DBA team, and you're going to rely on that DBA team that when they are creating new devices, new servers, standing up new databases, that they are in fact making sure that no local accounts exist, or that if there are local accounts, that they're tightly controlled, or they're onboarded into a vaulting platform. You're going to have a team that's responsible, possibly many teams that are responsible for your Windows devices, whether they're desktops or servers. So the idea that because we have this separation of duty, and obviously you have to have it in these large organizations, means that there are a lot of places where things could go wrong. And as we said, accounts are pervasive. They could literally live anywhere and really do live everywhere. And we've yet to run into a customer that can say definitively, Active Directory is the only place where accounts live, or Technology X is the only place that accounts live in the entire organization, and there is nothing else. It's virtually impossible to say that. And then when we start talking about those derived relationships, there's no easy way to just say, clearly this account is owned by this person or that account is owned by that other person. Finding ownership, and remember, ownership is key, right? And the reason ownership is key is that as a security person, as an infrastructure person, you cannot take the operational risk of making a change. So let's say you find an account and it's a local account and your policy is no local accounts, only AD accounts. You can't just delete that local account. What if that account's being used for a critical service and you delete that account and now you take down a critical application? As a security person, yeah, you're doing the right thing. As an infrastructure person, you're doing the right thing. You're adhering to policies. But by doing that right thing, you're introducing potentially a huge operational risk in the organization. So you need someone who understands what that account is, can take responsibility of that account, usually the application owner, and can say, yes, it is okay to do that, or no, don't do that. If you do that, we're going to break the most critical application in the firm. But I'll work with you and we'll figure out a way to get around this, but you cannot just delete that account. Here's the other thing is, I remember when I'm trying not to think about when I actually started my career, because it was a very long time ago. Everyone talked about, oh, mainframes are dead and mainframes are going away. No, nobody cares about mainframes. I'm sure there's people on this call right now, that people who will be listening to this afterwards, who have plenty of mainframe accounts and users and really old applications that the firm has been trying to move away from for years. And those things will not go away tomorrow. They simply won't. But you also can't ignore them, right? They represent, and even though it's a legacy system, if it's vulnerable, the bad guys aren't going to be forgiving. They're not going to say it's an old account in Sybase. Everyone's moving away from Sybase. I know there's critical customer data on that database, but I'm going to ignore it. I'm going to be a good guy and maybe attack their Cassandra database instead, because that's where they're moving everything. No, you have to pay attention to those legacy systems. You can't just have them sit on the shelf and think, yeah, no one's going to worry about those. If they can be attacked, they will be attacked. So how do you do it? How do you actually solve this problem? The first thing you need to do is hire an awful lot of people. We talked about the idea of requiring SMEs, of needing those subject matter experts who understand all the nuances, all the edge cases, all the different scenarios that you're going to run into to solve this problem, right? To understand this is how Oracle works, and this is all the nuances of getting this data. And you could get most of it, but then you got to do this other thing to get this other 5%. You have to have that team of people. Now, whether it's an internal team or you go out and hire a bunch of people, you need that team. And again, we talked about the idea of using internal people. They have full-time jobs, right? They have other things to work on. The other thing that you have to do is you have to write a bunch of scripts, and you have to maintain those scripts. And maybe they're not scripts, maybe they're full applications. And again, this goes back to why you need the SME, right? Because you can't just take a Windows person who knows PowerShell really well and say, okay, can you now collect this data from a Unix box, or collect this data from AIX, or can you go and collect this data from NetApp if we're talking about unstructured data? Well, that person is not an SME in that area, right? You need someone who understands how to write in that language. Otherwise, that person could probably figure it out, but it'll take them 10 times longer. And again, time is the enemy here, right? Time is not your friend. And as I said, those edge cases, those nuances, those are the things that'll get you, because no one's going to forgive you for those things. If you miss one account because it's such an edge case, if the bad person or the person that would do you harm sees that account, they will take advantage of it. This is another one. You're going to have to explain to management, to senior management, why is it taking so long? Again, especially if you're talking to someone who is not technical, in their mind, they just don't, fundamentally, they don't understand, why is this so hard? Why don't you have this already, right? So now you're taking on this program of saying, we're going to go and discover all of this stuff, But because of the complexities of discovery, the complexities of intelligent discovery, this will take some time, especially because you're not a software company, right? Your full-time job is to run security or infrastructure for your organization. It is not to actually build software to collect this data and maintain these scripts and these applications and all the people that you need in order to accomplish this task. Alternatively, and this is where the sales pitch comes in, everyone get ready, you could use Sphereboard. So let's talk a little bit about Sphereboard. So Sphereboard is essentially what I've been talking about, right? Our intelligent discovery goes out and does collect all this data with our agentless connectors. It does go out. We've baked into the product all of those SMEs that have to understand the nuances of an Oracle database or a Sybase database or Windows even. There are nuances around collecting AD data that we've run into over the many years of us doing this work. And we've baked that into the product. So let's talk about the product for a second. So our three offerings, our accounts, our main offerings are accounts, data, and groups, each around the discovery and the remediation. I know this call isn't really about remediation. We're actually going to have another webinar that's specifically about around reaching out to those owners and actually triggering the cleanup. But ultimately, our offerings are around accounts, data, and groups. And those three offerings sit on what we call the Identity Hygiene platform. And the platform is made up of these individual engines that have a specific task. Some of these you'll recognize as some of the things that I talked about in Discovery. The discovery engine, of course, that's the simple one, right? Then he has a type engine, understanding what is a service account versus an admin account versus a regular user account. Our ownership engine does those green lines that we saw in the previous slide of figuring out who is the best possible proposed owner. The controls engine of then overlaying that additional control. But the goal of the platform is to discover all your assets and ultimately, and again, we'll talk about this in future webinars, give you a mechanism to secure and protect those assets. Let's dig a little deeper into discovery and how we ultimately do discovery. On the left side of the slide, we see the assets. It could be databases, servers, a vaulting solution such as CyberArk, Active Directory. Our connectors collect all that raw data. And if you recall, I mentioned that you're going to get a lot of raw data, right? But the reason that we call it intelligent discovery, why it's more than just collecting this raw data, is the three boxes that are on the right side, right? What we do with that data. We determine who should own these assets, who should own that server, who should own that account, who should own that relationship between one or more assets. We determine what the account type is. We determine, is this a service account? Is it an admin account? And the most important thing in terms of determining the asset type is that controls and violations overlay, right? Again, looking at all these relationships, whether the relationships are derived or the relationships are collected, and then telling you exactly what's wrong, giving you a call to action so that you're not having to look at this huge jumble of data and have to analyze, okay, what exactly do I do here? The violations clearly tell you this is fix these things and risk goes down, essentially. And you set up and you configure your controls around that use case, configure your controls around industry best practices, as well as your internal policies. And the resulting violations tells you exactly what you need to do in order to adhere to those issues. And ultimately, what this all does, and the problem that this solves, is that idea of that full inventory, that full visibility into everything, right? The ability for you to see and prioritize what you should or shouldn't be working on, and also showing you the difference between quality and quantity, ultimately, when it comes to risk. Understanding this relationship is okay, and this other relationship is not okay. Fixing the relationship that's not okay will reduce risk and adhere to policies and stop the bad guys, which is ultimately why you would do this in the first place. So with that, we'll jump to any questions.
It looks like we've got two people who have submitted questions. So I will read them out and Rosie, you can answer them. How long does it typically take to discover accounts in a large organization?
So it depends. In most cases, we could find information about the major account sources like Active Directory, LDAP, other directories, things like Azure AD, it could take minutes, right? Or hours, depending on the size of the environment. And that will get you the vast majority of your environment. Because remember, one of the other things you might do is just the fact that an account exists and the entitlements of that account could justify a violation. So immediately you almost have the ability to take action. If we're talking about doing it manually, you have to build those scripts, you have to run those scripts, you have to schedule them. The other key thing with manual versus doing it with the product is that when you do it manually, you now have to manage running these things on a regular basis. Whereas in the product, we have scheduling built into it, and you schedule it once and you just let it do its thing. With the product, much, much faster than with doing it manually. Now, the other layer of complexity when it comes to collecting this data is things like DMZs and network segmentation and latency. Well, again, manually, you now have to deal with how do I communicate with these devices that are in a DMZ. With the product, we've baked that in with our concept of satellite servers. You stand up a satellite server, plug in, open up 2 ports instead of opening up 50 ports, and we're able to collect all the data. How quickly we can collect that data and give you actionable intelligence depends on the size of the organization, but I can tell you with the product, it's orders of magnitude faster than attempting to do it manually.
Thank you. So for companies with an IGA solution such as SailPoint, would Sphere be a complement or a partial replacement for Discovery?
We are absolutely a complement to a product like SailPoint. Some of the things that we could do with SailPoint that we've done with some of our other customers is actually collect some of this raw data, apply our intelligence around ownership, and then feed that data back to SailPoint so that the customer can do regular attestations with SailPoint. We've also had customers that know they have a big mess and they actually want to use a very purposeful tool to clean it up. And of course, when we do future webinars, when we're talking about workflow and we're talking about our virtual workers of how we actually can automate a lot of that cleanup, they might use us to do that initial cleanup. Then we are sending updated data to SailPoint on a regular basis. So we're still doing all that correlation, taking messy data, correlating it, cleaning it up, and then sending the results to SailPoint. So we could receive data from SailPoint. We could also send data back to SailPoint.
Okay, we've got one more in here, and if anybody has any questions they want to throw in, please don't hesitate. For the last question we've got right now, it says, what do you do with all the data that's been discovered? How do you go about fixing the issues?
Yeah, so that's a perfect question for the upcoming webinars. Ultimately, what you need to do, remember, I kept stressing how important ownership is, why ownership is so important, is that you need to offload that operational risk to the owner and get the owner to tell you it is okay to do what you want to do to reduce risk. So the next step in fixing these issues, or what you actually do with all this data, is reaching out to that owner and getting that owner to tell you it's okay to do what you want to do, and potentially giving you some additional information you need in order to do what you need to do. And then finally, it's actually doing the thing you want to do. Is it deleting an account that shouldn't exist? Is it removing some entitlement? Is it onboarding an account to a platform such as CyberArk? These are the things you do after you get all this data, because obviously collecting all this data is great and knowing everything you're doing wrong is great, but you need a way forward of actually, how do I go from this to actually reducing risk? I think in future webinars, we're going to do a deep dive into that owner attestation piece, as well as the actual remediation piece.
Awesome. That is a perfect transition. Our next episode is actually going to be about ownership. It's the risk paradox. Reducing security risk can come at the cost of operational risk. We'll go over how ownership ensures that the infrastructure and security teams are not the only ones responsible for potentially creating operational risk as a result of trying to reduce security risk. Make sure that you join in. If you haven't heard already, we have a podcast called Smells Like Identity Hygiene. It comes out the week before the webinar, so you get an opportunity to get a little background into what we'll be talking about before we present and come up with any questions. This will be live on the website. Our podcast is live anywhere that you stream podcasts, so you can go back and listen to our episode about discovery, and we'll make sure that we follow up with you guys with a link to this episode so you can go back and review it. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We really appreciate you coming. We'll see you next month. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.